OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the comings and goings of polymathic culture, as featured in Belonging Again 2.3 on Peter Burke, a problematic progress to one-sidedness and the social coordination mechanism. And we will be talking about the social coordination mechanism, which I've gotten into at Theory Underground, on the net, on this space online of people engaging in these communities like philosophy, portal, voicecraft, theory, etc., other life, who are collectively engaging in self-learning, their own education. They're coordinating social relationships using YouTube, Zoom, recording technologies, and this becomes something we talk about a lot in Belonging Again too. And this is, I think, a very significant infrastructure for developing subjectivity. So this is something we talk a lot in OG Rose, and it is very interesting to read about the history of the polymath in light of this, the development of this technology that I think is needed to dialectically work with the pricing mechanism of Hegel, so that the logic of capital does not overly train us against our humanity in favor of the techno Cthulhu that Mikey Downs talks about in light of Nick Land's work. Anyway, The Polymath by Peter Burke is a fascinating text. He talks about how today we might be seeing the extinction, or at least the endangerment, of a certain kind of intellectual, mainly the polymath, in favor of specialization and the specialist. And this does not mean specialization is bad or that focus is bad, but if there is a different way of learning and a different way of motivating ourselves through what I want to call a polymathic culture or a polymathic way of life, then if we are seeing certain problems in society or motivation or mental health or so on and so forth, we might want to try a different tool in our toolkit, if you will. We might want to try a different method. And what Burke describes with the polymath might be a different method, but one we may not even consider if we are overly confined to moralizing or assuming the best of specialist thinking. I think this tendency is more likely when we read history and basically almost see it as a movement from the polymathic to the specialist. And by polymath, Burke is not just referring to someone interested in many different things or a kind of Renaissance man who dabbles, but a polymath is someone who is a specialist in many fields. First off, this kind of breaks down the specialist versus generalist distinction, because we see in the polymath a true speciality emerges in many fields. And also, too, the idea, the polymath is interesting because they can work against this idea of a brain on a stick, or, someone who just uses their mind, because many of these polymaths are tinkering, they're using their hands, they're going on these vast expeditions. So the polymath is very interesting in that it kind of works against many of our assumptions and cultural associations of the intellectual with being in their head, not their hands, making us believe we have to choose between the specialist and the generalist. The polymath suggests otherwise. Now, because of this, Burke will talk more almost about one-sided or many-sided thinkers, because, again, the polymath shows you can be a generalist and a specialist. But then Burke will also say there's a certain culture of specialization that develops, which moralizes against the polymath. So there are, all of these sociological and cultural factors we have to take into account as well. But a key point that I think that Burke makes continually in his work is that we lose sight of the prevalence of the polymath in history, because we tend to remember thinkers, geniuses, creatives, according to a single discipline, and therefore we misremember them. So an example that I like is he makes of Leibniz. Leibniz, when I mention him, people say philosopher. Well, Leibniz was an expert on China when he was alive. He was a librarian. He did many things, but we don't tend to remember them that way. And also it becomes just cumbersome in language to every time you say Leibniz, say philosopher, librarian, blah, 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 blah. You just, we just naturally shorthand to philosopher. Well, when you go through this book, my gosh, like a very large number of the thinkers that we talk about in a single way, we see are very multifaceted, and they don't fit into a single box at all. There are people like Jefferson, you say, oh, president, but he's also a farmer, architecture, architect. You go through, people like Michel Poignet, you go, oh, chemist, or philosopher, and you forget he was also a chemist. You can go on. He lists all of these thinkers through history that we simply lose sight of how many-dimensioned they were. And you see, what I think actually ends up happening is that, sure, we look back and understand Aristotle, Plato, they seem to still mostly be remembered as more polymathic, because we go, oh, Aristotle, he was good in drama and metaphysics and physics and zoology. Well, actually, you could argue we forget he did a lot in zoology and categorizing sea life, and we just remember his philosophical fields. But generally, I do think we tend to remember, the further back we go with a thinker, I think there's a higher probability we do remember them as more polymathic. But this actually can create a certain problematic impression, because you have this idea that as we move to the present moment, we move out of the polymathic into the specialist, which can get matched up with a very problematic assumption of progress, that there is a progress, that it is progressive and therefore right to move from the polymathic to the specialized, that this is an intellectual evolution. I think this is very problematic, and actually is more just an impression we get because we misremember many thinkers as just being squeezed into a single field. We squeeze them into a single field is the phrase that Burke uses, which leads to this notion that going in the direction of the polymathic or the generalist is a devolution, like it's a mistake. And you see, if so much of the social coordination mechanism or space online entails people exploring many fields or going in a more, dare I say, polymathic direction, well, this is something that we can view with suspicion, or see it as a lack of discipline or something. And Burke also just describes how this assumption that a Renaissance man or someone who does many things is a novice or unfocused or is undisciplined, that's been historically common. It has been something that has always been lurking. And that is something that we still see today, but that's not new, that's always been there. But the people who resisted those critiques have benefited greatly from their polymathic training. I mean, I think we can also assume that in the past, the reason why they were polymathic because there was low-hanging fruit, right? You could argue that Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, and then the pre-Socratics are around at the beginning of philosophy. So yeah, it's easier to have a bunch of great thoughts because, not as many people are doing it, right? So then we can also assume that as we move from the polymathic is not really real in a way. It's more of just a privilege of a historic moment, right? If you were born early, you can be a polymath, but you can't do it anymore. And so we also kind of can think of the specialist as more noble or doing even harder work, whereas the polymath and the generalist is almost doing easier work and stuff that's simpler, right? And again, this would make us assume movements to become more polymathic are therefore lazy even, or less disciplined. And these, I think these are certainly impressions that Burke helps correct with his account. It is not the case that the polymathic is necessarily working less or something. Now, again, there is a great nobility in the scientists. The book Michael Strevens, I believe, in his book The Knowledge Machine, talks a lot about how the scientist and the researcher gathers up all this data, and there's a certain thinklessness to it. They just go and they gather, and not everyone appreciates it. So there's a certain honoring, I think, that the researcher deserves. But we can overdo it, and we can over nobilize that at the expense of the polymathic. And please also note, if there's something about the polymathic that seems needed for us to realize our full humanity so that we're not replaced by AI, or so that we can use AI in a more creative and human extending way, then it's really important that we don't have these assumptions against the polymathic that could prove that could just prove us set up to be replaced by AI. I mean, you could argue AI will always be the ultimate specialist. It will always be superior to the human, but the human precisely could be creative, and that could be really, really important. I mean, basically what we see in Burke's book is this idea that society's approval of the polymathic ebbs and flows. It comes and goes. Sometimes it's in fashion, other times it is not. And also we see this constant theme of gathering places, social meetings, clubs for the polymath, and how this was really important, and that you really can't think of the polymath as an isolated individual. They are very, they're situated in networks or connections. This makes me think of Randall Collins' work on the sociology of philosophy. It's very important work. One could think of the Silk Roads and encountering people along the way. We also, I think, another important idea is that specialization becomes a way to survive an overflow of information, and Burke talks about this a lot. When printing is cheaper and there's all these books, well then to become a polymath and read everything just seems impossible. And there's a way in which specialization is a reasonable response to information overload, because then you specialize in one field, otherwise you're just going to drown. And when there is an information overload, the push for specialization to basically survive is predictable. It tends to occur. It tends to arise. And so, that begs the question of, are we today faced with AI going to have a great return to specialization, or are we going to have a movement toward more polymathic general thinking? It's not given. That's what's very interesting. The explosion of information could go either way, depending on if we're prepared for it, if our sociological associations are not against becoming multifaceted. There's a lot of things that really depend. I think also the book talks about sorting mechanisms and how when you have an explosion of new information, it's really important that there are new sorting mechanisms. Library sciences, like we mentioned with Leibniz, tend to correspond with this. And I think really a lot of the question on if explosions of information go in the direction of a new specialization and narrowness or generality, hopeless, and also hopeless. There can be a despair with a lot of new information because it's now vivid to you how much you're missing. Whereas if you're missing a lot but you don't know it, it's almost easier to live with. When you have these information explosions, you can kind of experience all the stuff you don't know. So that can lead to melancholia and despair and different things. But there's something here too where the likelihood of the overload going in one direction versus the other seems to depend on the sorting mechanisms that are there at the time. And if there's something about the social coordination mechanism that is a really effective means of sorting information, and I think, when you can see videos of people having conversations about ideas, they can model. There are models of learning for oneself, drive. It's more easy to access communities by which to discuss ideas. I think that is a sorting mechanism that is extremely powerful and increases the probability that information overload goes in a polymathic direction versus a new specialization. Also, every person who is intrinsically motivated or motivated themselves to learn is themselves a sorting mechanism. Because they're sorting information, they're learning different things, and they're bringing in what they've curated to you. Everyone on the SCM, the social coordination mechanism, is a curator, and so that's also it's a curation of a curation, you can say, and I think that's a notably unique and effective mechanism of information sorting that could be argued has not been available before. Another thing that's interesting is Burke points out how the polymath uses analogy and likeness and simile to enter into new fields. I talked about that with Clayton and Guy Senstock regarding Sanders and Hofstadter's work on basically how all thought is analogous, and maybe there's something about polymathic culture that trains people in analogy, which just very directly trains thought. So the use of analogy also seems really important. And I also think basically this polymathic culture, or this kind of subjectivity trained by the polymath, is also probably the precondition necessary for us to socially organize ourselves versus be organized by capital, which is something we talk a lot at O.G. Rose and with Theory Underground and Cadell and others. And so that's also really important. I think also what we see in this book is a different theory of education where, again, you could say that the specialist picks a topic and they stay focused on it for decades, which is certainly a valid way to learn. But then there's also an idea that an interrelation and intersection of many fields can have your expertise emerge to you. It can be something that just emerges out of that collection of ideas. And new fields, Burke talks a lot about new disciplines like sociology or computer science that actually emerge out of this polymathic intersection of many fields. And what's very interesting is I think there's a suggestion here that we might gain our expertise in the intersection of many fields, not simply in the commitment to a field, which again doesn't mean you can't be an expert in a more narrow commitment to a field. But if that's not working, then we might want to consider an environment of intersection. And I think also there's something about the polymath that needs or suggests lively, dynamic environments as inspiring learning. The other thing I'm interested in is the difference between being kind of in the midst of ideas, and ideas are just in the air and you just see them online and something catches you, it jumps out to you, you apprehend it, like noose, as Thomas Jockin has been talking about, and how you experience ideas that way versus when ideas are given to you by a teacher and you got to learn them or you're going to fail the test. I think the likelihood of intrinsic motivation and self-teaching is far higher regarding ideas you happen upon or that appear to you and that just catch you. They just catch your interest versus ideas that are given to you by a teacher on more authority. I mean, basically the whole idea of a classroom is that you don't have to decide or judge that these ideas are important. They are important, because they're going to be on the test. And so I do think it is more likely to avoid the pitfalls of bestocentrism, as we talk about with Nietzsche at the Philosophy Portal Conference, when you're in a culture where ideas are in the air and they're just online. So the SCM, the social coordination mechanism, just makes there be ideas all around you. And the likelihood of one catching you and then motivating you to explore it, I think, is higher there. And if there's something about that, a certain relation to ideas themselves that make them more unknown, and thus things that are interesting to explore, if that is a characteristic of the polymathic way of life, then this is another reason why the internet could be really important. It can change how ideas motivate us. I think we have a real problem today of people being motivated to learn or to engage in lifelong learning. But that might be strongly influenced by how ideas are received and in what context they're received. And if instead we can create environments where they're just caught or just stumbled upon, this could be a big deal. This could increase the likelihood of intrinsic motivation and things like that. I think also if you're online encountering ideas, it invites you to judge them and to think about them, which this is really kind of funny because, the classroom, there's a way in which the internet, precisely because it's a place of consumption and finding stuff you like, that because it's vivid about that, might increase the likelihood that you're aware you could be deceived or these ideas could be wrong, so you have to go in with more judgment and more awareness. Whereas a classroom can present itself precisely as a place where you're not consumers, you're students. But you see, actually, you are being given ideas to consume, but you don't really learn to judge them or discern them. You memorize them. Well, here's a great problem. If there's something about the human being that requires judgment and discernment, and Jockin talks about this with Aristotle, I think it's true, and if we require this basically to maintain humanity, to make judgments on what is valuable and what is true, good and beautiful, then oddly, it might be more likely we realize we need to do that online than in a classroom, precisely because online we know we're being catered to. And so there's an interesting paradox there that makes me think of Ebert's saturation theory with freak theory that seems very important. And so we might be more likely to train judgment and also to engage in things like conversation versus mere communication, as we talked about with Theory Underground. But Burke talks about how there's all these fields that are polymathic that have emerged: sociology, anthropology, computer science, general systems, symbiotics, and more. And, if we can return and generate a polymathic culture or an acceptance of learning for learning's sake, a characteristic of that would be a society where if you're, say, teaching yourself mathematics, you're not going to have your neighbor ask you, why are you learning that? Are you going to is it for a job or is it for a paper? That's a kind of a litmus test of if your society is polymathic or not. If people don't really get they think it's kind of irrational to learn something for learning's sake, even if they say otherwise. If really the social signals suggest it's naive, then this is not a polymathic society. But if we were to actually return to a polymathic culture, which these SCM could help with, and that it might help incubate, then who knows what new vistas of thought might emerge? Who knows what possibility of the human might happen? There are questions of time energy that Theory Underground talks about that seems needed for this. But I do agree with Mikey when he says that, we've never seen what humanity might be capable of if we all had our time energy. And certainly we've never seen what humanity could do if it was equipped with a social coordination mechanism that was truly effective, like I think we now have the potential of. And what might we see? What minute vistas open up? And I think that those are questions that Peter Burke, in his book on the Polymath, can help us ask and help us have hope in asking and motivate us to attempt. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. You can find our books on Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated, and thank you so much for your time.